Well, let's get on to our panel now. Joining me from New York is Simon Marks. He's the president and chief correspondent for Feature Story News. With me here in the studio is Gadeir Abbas. He's a professor and activist and a former attorney at the Council on American-Islamic Relations. And joining us from Boston is Max Abrahms. He's an assistant professor of political science at Northeastern University. Welcome to all of you to the show. Simon, there's been a great deal of back and forth, as we've been hearing for the past 24 hours or so, on why this happened. What was the motive, as I've just been talking to Mei Lee about? Let's take a listen to what the FBI is saying.
It would be irresponsible and premature of me to call this terrorism. The FBI defines terrorism very specifically, and we are still, that is the big question for us, is what is the motivation for this?
So Simon, put this in some kind of perspective for us. Why is the FBI treading so carefully here?
Well, I think, and because they've got to tread carefully, I mean, the answer to that question, what was the motivation for this, has all sorts of implications, particularly for President Obama, who was flanked by his national security team at the White House just a few hours ago. Because if indeed the motivation for this was some sort of sympathy for radicalized groups overseas, then that changes the character of this incident away from something different if it had merely been an issue of workplace violence, albeit another tragic paroxysm of workplace violence in the United States. So there are implications if it is indeed concluded that Farouk Syed and perhaps also his wife had somehow been radicalized during their travels to Saudi Arabia. And it's also worth making the point, as May was making earlier in the program, you know, the size of that armory that police say they discovered in the home in Redlands would suggest that if this was a case of workplace violence, it may not have only been a case of workplace violence. And so I think that's why time has to be given to these investigators to try and piece together exactly what sort of international travels the couple may have had, who they met, and what ultimately their motivations may have been. And of course, the motivations could have been mixed.
So Gadeir, as Simon says, there are implications on how this crime is characterized, but are we already seeing a lot of anti-Islamic sentiment, anti-Muslim rhetoric in the wake of this attack?
Absolutely, and really the attack just further illuminates the anti-Muslim sentiment that began after 9/11, grew exponentially since 9/11, and is now a mainstream phenomenon that Republican presidential candidates are exploiting for their political benefit. In the United States, terrorism means something that's a double standard. Terrorism means violence committed by Muslims. And so what you see is the knee-jerk reaction to conclude that this is terrorism when the facts are not known. It's possible that this is terrorism, but the knee-jerk reaction reflects a reality of American life right now, that whenever a Muslim is involved in an act of violence, the conclusion invariably is, for a large segment of the public, that it's an act of terrorism motivated by the religious beliefs of those Muslims.
Max, at least one major media outlet here in the United States is quoting unnamed sources as saying that one of the shooters was radicalized. And we also have some law enforcement authorities who are looking into this. They're looking at a visit that Syed Farouk, one of the shooters, made to Saudi Arabia. So what is this pointing to?
It's pointing to terrorism. I hate to be the one to say it here, but I mean, I understand why law enforcement is being cautious. Last night, I was also very cautious because we knew that it was a non-state actor that attacked a civilian target, but we didn't know the motive. We didn't know, we didn't really have a sense whether there was a political agenda. And that's what you need for it to be terrorism. A non-state actor who attacks a civilian target for some kind of a presumed political or ideological goal. And over the course of today, there's been all sorts of information which, if true, suggests that indeed the perpetrators were at least politically minded in some way. But there's discussion of their being radicalized, of their traveling to Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, of their interactions with other terrorists. And furthermore, the fact that they were so weaponized and really prepared to wage battle and to go in there as a couple unlike mass shootings in the past, all point in the same direction to terrorism.
Okay, Gadeir, you want to respond to that?
When Dylann Roof massacred an African-American congregants praying, the characterization of his actions was not, he's a non-state actor, targeting a soft facility because of his ethnic profile. He was a white male. We don't call the violent activity, even when it's politically motivated, like the attack just days ago on a women's healthcare facility that explicitly was conducted to stop that women's healthcare facility from providing its health services. We never described that as terrorism. We never described that as someone who's a non-state actor. And that's all, again, that's not to say that what happened in California wasn't directed by a foreign organization or wasn't an act of terrorism, but our reaction to that and the way that we're understanding it is a reflection ultimately of anti-Muslim sentiment in
Right,
the
and
US.
we don't know the motive yet. I mean, even the police are telling us. Max, I'm going to come to you in a moment. I just want to get to Simon. Simon, you want to say something?
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think with respect to Gadeir, we do describe those incidents as acts of terrorism. The police and the authorities in the case of the attack on the Planned Parenthood headquarters absolutely described it using the word terrorism. The attack on Charleston, South Carolina was absolutely described as terrorism, and I've been covering gun violence in the United States long enough to remember the attack on and the explosive attack on the Oklahoma City Federal building, which you will remember initially many people jumped in a knee-jerk way to assume was an act of terrorism related to the Middle East, but ultimately reflected and revealed to Americans that there were homegrown terrorists here in the United States in the form in that attack of Timothy McVeigh. I mean, the semantics of this notwithstanding, it's the paroxysm of violence that you're witnessing, whatever the motivation, that leads to all sorts of questions of a political nature, whether they are about relations between Muslim Americans and other Americans, or gun owners and other Americans, or whether in the case of the Planned Parenthood attack, they also introduced the third rail in American politics of the abortion issue into the debate. I mean, these are all acts of terrorism.
Max, go ahead.
Well, I mean, in fairness, I did an interview in Foreign Policy where I did label those other non-Muslim attacks as terrorism. I'm very careful to apply a consistent definition. Again, 3 parts: a non-state actor attacking a civilian target for a political goal, regardless of what that ideology might be. However, your guest is right with the broader point, which is that most Americans do not use a standard definition for terrorism, and Americans are much more likely to consider an act terrorism when the perpetrators are Muslim. And of course, that's unfair.
And that's the problem, isn't it, Gadeir, that this term, terrorism, it's kind of a malleable term here. It can be shifted, it can be moved, it can be molded to whoever's saying it and how it suits them.
Absolutely, and that has consequences for the lives of American Muslims and the lives of all Americans. What happens is when you call something terrorism, there's a sense that we need to have a policy response that addresses that terrorism, and that policy response is facilitated by the label of terrorism. So while the incident at the women's healthcare clinic, Dylann Roof's attack, has led to no policy changes at all, acts of terrorism committed by Muslims justify inevitably the erosion of civil liberties of American Muslims first, but all Americans. All of the pervasive, mass, and indiscriminate surveillance laws are justified out of a fear of Islam and a fear of Muslims. The exploding size of federal watch lists are justified by a fear of Muslims. Even the evidence that's being, I think the evidence that's being cited as evidence that this is terrorism are things that you can attribute to essentially any American Muslim. Every American Muslim knows someone who is, in the government's eye, a known or suspected terrorist, because every American Muslim knows someone who is denied the ability to board planes, who's searched every single time they fly, and that's the problem. The problem is not is not that there's this double standard. The problem is that that double standard leads to adverse consequences.
Okay, we are going to take a break.